We haven't had perhaps sufficient opportunity for really exploring all that is in the Secret Doctrine, and particularly for exploring some of the ideas that are there, which certainly are being increasingly validated today in terms of contemporary thought, particularly science. I had hoped that we would have more of an opportunity for that, but I think when one is familiar with some of the principal ideas of the Secret Doctrine, some of the basic concepts that are presented to us, then indeed one begins to see the correlations with contemporary thought. One begins to see how much contemporary thought has moved in this direction. And that, of course, is, to me at least, extremely exciting. And when one reads some of the books that are being published today in the field of science, for example, religious studies also, philosophy, one begins to see the extent to which many of these ideas have been and are being taken up, explored, and really examined much more thoroughly. So just to recapitulate a bit, our first session together, we talked about the modes of thought to which HPB refers, and that we do have to examine how we think. We are so accustomed to our own manner of thinking that we perhaps are not aware that there are other modes of thought. We just are not familiar. It's the mode of thought that we know, because obviously that's the way we think. And we may think everybody thinks the same way. One only has to travel around the world, particularly to cultures which are very different from our own, such as in Asia, to travel in India, for example, or in any of the Asian countries, to travel in Japan, any of the Asian countries, to realize that there are different modes of thinking, and we're not used to them. And if we think everybody thinks as we do, you soon discover that this is indeed not true, that people do think in different ways. So we talked about that, and the mode of thought that is necessary for really understanding the Secret Doctrine. It's another attitude, and I think that these volumes, by the very way in which they're presented, the very mode of writing, which is different from reading an ordinary textbook, the very mode of writing gives us access to and stimulates in us a different mode of thought. So that we talked about to some extent. Then we looked at some of the sources of the Secret Doctrine. And I had suggested that we could look at some contemporary theories, not simply the work that has been done in the discovery of certain Tibetan manuscripts, which certainly identify the source of these works, but also to recognize that it really doesn't matter what may have been the source of the work on which H.P. Blavatsky based her commentaries. It's as though she chose a rather obscure work which again excited a different mode of thought. Certainly it was a work not at all known in the last century when she wrote and when she introduced it to the world, the stanzas of Dhyan. This must have been a bombshell to academic scholars. Where did she come upon this? What is it? And so on. And it was merely, if I may put it this way, merely a device on which she hung the exposition of these fundamental principles. It was, again, to stimulate, I think, a mode of thought. Today, there is probably more evidence of the existence of many, many manuscripts of which we know very little. A very different attitude than that in the 19th century, when many scholars felt that anything worth discovering had already been discovered, and therefore nothing new could really, if it weren't known by an Oxford graduate, for example, it wasn't worth knowing, and therefore probably didn't exist and was somebody's fancy. But a very different attitude today. We know that there is a continual discovery. Remember, this was long before the Dead Sea Scrolls, the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library, even therefore of the Gnostic texts of Western civilization, let alone long before the uncovering of many of the Tibetan texts which have now are coming into the West and are being translated. And then we talked about really what is the basis of Volume 1, cosmogenesis, the whole underlying cosmogonic process as presented in the Secret Doctrine through these amazing stanzas of Volume 1, and suggested that there is a kind of progressive development in the cosmogonic process, which is repeated in the process of anthropogenesis. And we looked at that in terms of the great archetypal motifs found in all creation myths. Mythology is coming to be recognized as a legitimate field of study once again. In the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century and well into the 20th century, myth was thought to be simply fancy and could be safely left for children. Now it is recognized as a legitimate area of investigation, that it has meaning in terms of the development of consciousness, the psychic growth of the soul, the growth of the psyche or soul. And then yesterday we looked very quickly at Volume 2, nothing like a quick survey of all that is there in anthropogenesis in terms of the stages of development, and recognized that if we really are to understand what we're all about, our place in the universe, we need to know something of our own origins. What we believe about ourselves and our origins has a great deal to do with what we believe about our destiny and our future. What we believe about what is our relationship with the planet on which we live has a great deal to do with how we're going to treat this planet. And we're more alert to that today than we certainly were 100 years ago when the Secret Doctrine was published. So we looked at those stages in terms of the awakening of the principles which constitute man and the triple evolutionary scheme to which HPB refers. So today I thought we should look really at what I call the ethics of the Secret Doctrine, because I think the ultimate lesson of HPB's work lies in an understanding of the ethical implications of the principles. Sometimes individuals say, well, it's too deep a study. I really am not interested in the origins of the universe. I'm not interested in knowing about Fohat and Akasha and Mula Prakriti and all these strange terms to the Western ear. Terms that really, this has nothing to do with how I go shopping every day. It has nothing to do with how I'm going to treat my neighbor. It has nothing to do with cooking dinner tonight. It has nothing to do with driving a car and getting on in the world. I suggest that it does, that it has a very great deal to do, even with how one cooks dinner and how one drives a car, how one treats the earth, how one treats one's neighbor. There are ethical implications, and we all of us move from a background of a belief system, if you like. We move from what we believe about ourselves and about others. This is how we act. We all have a metaphysics, whether we know it or not. We may not call it that, but we all have a metaphysical position. And we all have certain ideas about purpose and meaning in existence. So I suggest that indeed these principles are extremely practical and have a great bearing on our lives. And the pivotal doctrine, as I've pointed out again and again, referred to throughout this week, HPB is very clear at the very outset in her proem that there is a pivotal doctrine. Now that must mean the central doctrine. Everything else revolves around. And that's what a pivot is. Everything else revolves around it. Is that we are self-responsible. That we can't put it off onto someone else for our actions, our thoughts, our feelings. And that the outcome of the entire cosmogonic process lies within each one of us. We are responsible. So this morning I want to talk about what I call being and responsibility, as it's put on the program that you have, were given at the outset of this series. And to do that, I thought we'd start with these 2 pages that I've given you this morning, important principles. I started this with a little paragraph from the introduction to Aldous Huxley's book, The Perennial Philosophy. You'll remember on the first morning I listed a whole number of synonyms, thank you, synonyms for the Secret Doctrine. The Secret Doctrine, as it is the name of, not only the name of these volumes, but the Secret Doctrine is also, without being italicized or capitalized, is the name for that teaching doctrine. It is a teaching. It is a teaching. There is a doctrine that has all, and why is it called secret when it's published here in 2 volumes? Is this all there is to it? Well, it's secret until we use it. It's secret until we really explore it, until we make it our own. There are other names for this: the esoteric philosophy, the esoteric tradition. And one of the names you remember that I put up was the term that Aldous Huxley used, the perennial philosophy, or philosophia perennis. He gives it in the Latin form. And you'll notice that he makes it include 3 things. The metaphysic that recognizes a divine reality substantial to the world of things and lives and minds. First of all, therefore, a metaphysic that recognizes the first fundamental proposition of the Secret Doctrine, a divine reality which underlies substantial to the world of things and lives and minds. The psychology that finds in the soul something similar to or even identical with. Now, I've quoted Huxley, but from the theosophical point of view, we would simply cross out something similar to, or similar to. We would say that finds in the soul something identical with. So you can cross that out, but I couldn't do it to Huxley. I had to put it in there. But the theosophical position is that it is identical with divine reality. And then the ethic that places man's final end in the knowledge of the immanent and transcendent ground of all being. If you like, we can put this in this manner. I like blue. We'll continue to use blue. So it is a metaphysic it is a psychology and it is an ethic. And we'll try to explore something of that. The metaphysic is then an ultimate reality. Which HPB says may be called be-ness, the first fundamental proposition. And that is there in the first of the quotations which I've given you from Volume 1, page 120, a marvelous statement, and indeed she says this is the one fundamental law in the whole tradition, the radical unity of the ultimate essence of each constituent part of compounds in nature. Incidentally, when the term radical is used, this does not have to do with radicalism in any political sense, but in the true meaning of the word radical, which is the root. Radical means root, you see. We have used it in the political sense of far left or far right, and we say these are the radicals of our day. But here the term radical unity is used in its original meaning as the root unity, the fundamental unity, that unity which is truly radical because it is the ground of our being. The radical unity of the ultimate essence of each constituent part of compounds in nature, from star to mineral atom, from the highest Ion Chohan to the smallest infusorium, in the fullest acceptation of the term, and whether applied to the spiritual, intellectual, or physical worlds. Now, that should remind you of something. Spiritual, intellectual, and physical. What does that remind you of?
Yesterday's classification.
Yesterday's classification of the triple evolutionary scheme, doesn't it? So at every level, this is the triple evolutionary scheme, which for our system, you remember, she said, is interwoven and interblended, so that we sort of progress at all levels at once. There is an interaction among all these levels. This unity is the one fundamental law in occult science. We'll come back to some of these. So the metaphysic is an ultimate reality, a unity, which is be-ness, she says, an ultimate be-ness, which pervades the universe. In psychology, then, this is what then is an identity of each with all, but therefore implies a becoming, because it is a matter of consciousness. The identity is there, the identity of each soul with the universal oversoul, which is the third fundamental proposition, but it has to be in terms of becoming, doesn't it? That is, we have to grow into the consciousness of this unity. The unity is there, but do we know it? And you see, we may say, well, it's there, yes, I agree, everything is one, but why do we act as though it were not? You see. And so there has to be a becoming. The ethic, then, is that self-responsibility. Hope I spelled that right. Yes. The self, that we are responsible, but we are self-responsible. And that leads then, I suggest, to a being. Being in the true sense that we are knowing we are one. This becoming leads to that kind of being which has its own individual quality. I think one of the great paradoxes, perhaps, which it's difficult to talk about in one sense, but is a paradox, is that one is both one with all and yet uniquely individual. Uniquely individual. It's not a loss of individuality, but a heightening of individuality. in a true awareness.
Heightened and expanding.
Heightened and expanded, yes. Heightened and expanded. This is perhaps the paradox, because the self-realized individual, the Buddha, for example, or any of the great world teachers, Jesus, Gautama, Zoroaster, Krishna, any of the great world teachers, is an individual, fully individual, a knower, a genuine knower. You remember we used that term, it's one of the synonyms, the knower, the Gnostic, the Jnana Yogi is the knower. The true knower is individual, but knows that he is one with all. But there is a great beauty in the individual, isn't there? So I call it being, if you like. So all of these statements, which we might look at to some extent, I think help us to see what is this progression. And we begin to, you can even begin to take under the metaphysic then, the principles that are given. See how they work out in terms of the psychology, your growth. And then what is the action that follows from them? What is that self-responsibility that follows from them? And I thought that Aldous Huxley's statement, therefore, gave us a wonderful little pattern that we can use, and that's why I started with it. This, of course, then, helps us to understand, we can put it this way, something that I said earlier in this particular series. If you look at item 6, which is at the bottom of page 2 and goes on to page 3, that there is that ultimate, page 2 is on the back, you'll see it, page 1, that there are two ones. Now you'll remember that we have discussed this in terms of cosmogony, in terms of the creation myths, that in occult metaphysics there are, properly speaking, two ones. The one on the unreachable plane of absoluteness and infinity, on which no speculation is possible, and the second one on the plane of emanation. Now you remember we came to this mirror reflection sort of principle, the reflection being emanation. The former can neither emanate nor be divided, as it is eternal, absolute, and immutable. The second being, so to speak, the reflection of the first one, for it is the Logos, or Ishvara, in the universe of illusion, can do all this. HPB had to use clumsy terms because there were no other terms for it. Two ones. How can there be two ones? This, of course, is why I frequently refer to the whole metaphysic of the Secret Doctrine as not monistic, but non-dualistic, which is a better way, perhaps, of saying it, because monism implies this second one, as she calls it, you see. The moment you have one, you are implying that there is a division possible. But when there is non-dual, there is no division. And this, of course, is the literal meaning of Advaiti, a, non, vaiti, two, dva, two. So non-dual, not two. And again, how do we come to the realization of this? How do we move to an understanding of it?
Don't we have to realize there is polarity, however?
There, now we begin to see, yes. And this is, of course, very true. We begin to recognize there is not duality, but polarity. And this makes it a very different kind of vision. That it's not dual, it's non-dual, but within that emanation, that reflection that arises, there is polarity. For example, I think perhaps one of the easiest examples is the continuum of temperature. Temperature is one, as it were, or non-dual. Temperature itself is non-dual. But it has polarities, which we call hot and cold. And it differs for every individual, you see. These are not two separate opposites, but they are part of a continuum. We get this in the electric bar, the electric magnet. You see, however thinly you slice the electric bar, you still have a polarity of positive and negative.
Nothing can happen until there's polarity.
And nothing can happen until there is that kind of polarity, you see. So we're going to, I think an interesting way of looking at it is that we have two eyes. But we do not see two separate things with our two eyes. You may, if you go to the oculist or optometrist, and you cover one eye and then you cover the other and so on. But we use the two eyes together, and we have a depth vision, a 3D dimensional depth dimension in seeing with the two eyes. But the two eyes act in unison then. So there's a polarization, not an opposition, not two separate things, but rather always this underlying unity. Now, as we come to, in this becoming process of knowing this, of realizing this, what does this mean in terms of the ethic that arises from it, in terms of being responsible? What does this mean? I think we begin to see then that there are not separate things, there is relationship. Throughout the entire universe, there is relationship. And what is that relationship then? I am responsible for the relationship. Rather than saying, well, you're at fault. You say, you're out there, you did this to me, you hurt me, you did this, you made it difficult, you put a stone in the road, and I fell over it, and so on. All of this. That there is now a polarity, and there is a relationship. And what is that relationship? We begin to have another point of view. And I think this comes, therefore, to an ethic, a way of living, a way of acting. We can say, my thoughts are very private. Don't intrude in my thought. Get out of my dreams, if you were, as it were. My thought is my own. But can there be any thought that is separate, that is not part of the whole? Any feeling, any emotion that is not part of this continuum then? It's a polarization rather than an opposition. There are not then separate things, but only the relationship that I then am responsible for. So it gives us a different meaning. Well, let's look at some of the others as time permits. One of my favorites is number 2. This is from the papers that were HPB's papers to her esoteric students, and therefore is found in the 5th volume of the Adyar edition. I'm sorry I didn't put down, I should have, well, I can give you, yes. In volume 12 of the collected writings, it's on page 624. If you don't have the Adyar edition and you want to know the reference, in volume 12 of the collected writings of HPB, it's on page 624. It happens to be one of my favorites, and it points again to this necessity to come back to the metaphysic, because our action and our growth in consciousness, that is our psychology, are dependent upon our metaphysical position. It's a wonderful statement. To understand this abstruse metaphysical doctrine fully and correctly. And of course, this abstruse metaphysical doctrine is the secret doctrine, the esoteric philosophy, the occult tradition, the perennial philosophy, the forgotten truth of Houston Smith, all of those terms that we had on the board earlier. To understand it fully and correctly, one has to be thoroughly impressed with an idea. And then I love this phrase, which I have in vain endeavored to impart to Theosophists at large. One feels, this of course was written near the end of her life. This was after the formation of her esoteric group, so it had to be after 1888, because this is not only the centenary this year of the publication of the Secret Doctrine, it's the centenary of the establishment of the esoteric school, which she established in 1888. And here she says she's endeavored in vain to impart to Theosophists this idea, namely the great axiomatic truth that the only eternal and living reality is that which the Hindus call Paramatman and Parabrahman. Now, these two in the Vedantic tradition are one. Para-Atman and Para-Brahman are one. There is an utter identity between that universal principle of spirit, if you like, Atman, and that universal creative principle, which is Para-Brahman. They are one. They are not separate. And this, of course, is very clear in the Advaita Vedanta philosophy of Shankaracharya and his successors. This is the fundamental principle, the ultimate reality. This is the one ever-existing root essence. That's the radical unity she's spoken of in Volume 1, which I have there as number 1. The ever-existing root essence, immutable and unknowable to our physical senses, but manifest and clearly perceptible to our spiritual natures. Once imbued with that basic idea, incidentally, you remember on the first morning together I suggested that this is indeed unknowable, but not non-experienceable. That is, it is experienceable in terms of the growth of consciousness. In terms of consciousness, therefore perceptible to our spiritual natures, unknowable to our physical senses. And this, remember, was written at a time when the science of her day said that if it was not known by the physical senses, it was just not possible to approach it, unknowable. But she says clearly perceptible, which is in a sense the experience indeed of illumination of the Buddha, if you like. Once imbued with that basic idea and the further conception that if it, that is that ultimate reality, is omnipresent, universal and eternal, like abstract space itself, and indeed identified with abstract space, we must have emanated from it, and we must someday return to it. Now know that, and all the rest becomes easy. So if you really know that, isn't that a marvelous statement? All the rest becomes easy. Then everything else, all the other principles, all the other ideas, all the other concepts are very easy. That's all we really need to know. But do we know it? Do we really know it? Are we imbued with this basic idea? Do we act in ways that contradict? We may know it intellectually, and that's not knowing. We may, hold it as it's a nice, grand, lofty thought. It's like saying, I feel very brotherly when I'm alone. Nobody's disturbing me in my meditation at 5 a.m. in the morning. Nobody is around. And I am most peaceful. I am most brotherly. I am aware of the unity of all life because I am alone. let the phone ring, let anybody enter my room, or when I go out and meet people on the street, then it's quite a different matter. Brotherhood then sort of disappears for the moment.
That like the saying, I love humanity as people, I can't
Yes,
stand.
I love you. Yes, I love humanity, but it's people I can't stand. But here she says, once imbued with that, you see, really, one's whole structure, one's whole being is permeated with this, and the further conception that not only have we come from it, that is, we are the reflection of that. And we must someday return to it, not by the loss of personhood, perhaps by the loss of personality, but not by the loss of personhood, of individuality, of the uniqueness. Return to it in a fully self-conscious manner. This is the process of becoming by means of our self-responsibility. Then everything else becomes easy. It's a wonderful statement, isn't it? You see. But we really do not always recognize it. And so perhaps we have time just to consider the third statement, which again emphasizes this, but recognizes the position that we hold in regard to it. All that which is emanates from the Absolute, which from this qualification alone stands as the one and only reality. Hence, everything extraneous to this Absolute, the generative and causative element, the whole process then of becoming, must be an illusion, but only from the purely metaphysical point of view. Now that doesn't mean it's a delusion, but only that it is an appearance. This is what illusion is, you see. It's the magic play. And that's why very frequently the creative principle, the Shakti, or feminine aspect of the creative principle is referred to as Maya. It is a magical show, you see. And it's illusion in the sense that it really is a magical appearance. And this is what is cosmos. You remember I spoke about this distinction between chaos, which is this primordial, abstract space in which there appears, as if by magic, and it is a magical show, all the multiplicity of existence, which is an appearance, which is the cosmos. It's the cosmetic, if you like, on the face of chaos, which is the appearance. And that's our only way of coming at it, is to deal with the cosmetic, so to speak. Because the word cosmetic is the same as the word cosmos. It comes from it. But only from the purely metaphysical view. And so she uses a marvelous analogy here. A man who regards himself as mentally sane and is so regarded by his neighbors calls the visions of an insane brother whose hallucinations make the victim either happy or supremely wretched, whichever it may be. He calls those visions illusions and fancies likewise. But where is that madman for whom the hideous shadows in his deranged mind, his illusions, are not for the time being as actual and as real as the things which his physician, that should be his physician, I'm sorry, or keeper may see. Everything is relative in this universe. Again, we come to this relational. But the experience on any plane is an actuality for the percipient being whose consciousness is on that plane. Though the said experience regarded from the purely metaphysical standpoint may be conceived to have no objective reality. So it is, the process of becoming is important. Never underestimate the necessity for physical incarnation, for it is here where we achieve. every step in the progress. From a purely metaphysical point of view, this is an appearance, and it is a temporary appearance. But it gives us the experience that leads to the becoming, the growth of consciousness. And only by this can there be this growth in consciousness. A marvelous statement. So don't dismiss, you say, oh, well, it's merely illusion. That's not the point. The point is that it is not, that one must see behind the appearance to the reality and be aware, therefore, that it is in the relationship that consciousness is awakened, and therefore it has meaning in the process of becoming towards being. Well, let us stop at this point. I'd like, from this point, to, of course, invite your comments. But before we do that, having talked about the fact that this is an appearance, and remembering some of the philosophic tradition of the last century, which we mentioned, look at number 5, which is on page 2. Again, from volume 1. You will notice that I have taken all of these quotations from volume 1 because basically these are dealing with the fundamental principles which then are exhibited or witnessed in the human development. To put it another way, and perhaps in a scientific way, and to use a phrase that I came to from Fritz Kunz, so I have to attribute it to him. Man is the chief test object of the universe. It's a kind of scientific phrase, but it's, I think, a very accurate one. Every field of existence is known by its action upon objects within the field. And so man is the test object of the whole universe. And this is why the psychology is so important. It's the reflection of the metaphysics. But it works out then as a behavioral mode, a mode of conduct, which is an ethic. And this is really what, to me, is most important. How do we live our lives because of this metaphysical position? So, noticing that the universe is indeed a reflection, an emanation, an appearance. The pure object, apart from consciousness, is unknown to us. And this, imagine making that statement 100 years ago, you see. From one point of view, this is Kantian, isn't it? Very much Kantian. From another point of view, today, we know that any observation of the material universe, of the physical universe, certainly at the subatomic level, is influenced by the observer. So that the pure object is unknown to consciousness. One cannot observe the subatomic particles without affecting the subatomic particles. The very observation changes them. And consequently, Heisenberg's principle of indeterminacy and so on. And Wheeler's, Dr. John Wheeler's marvelous statement, the observer and the observed are indeed, we live in a participatory universe. They are one. A statement made by Krishnamurti, that the thinker is the thought, you see. So here she is saying it, the pure object apart from consciousness is unknown to us while living on the plane of our three-dimensional world, as we know only the mental states it excites in the perceiving ego. And everything we look at excites a state of consciousness within us. Now, how we look at it governs then what that state of consciousness is. If I look at you and say, well, you're very different from me. You obviously, you have green hair and red eyes and 4 arms and so on. So obviously you're very different. And this excites not only a mental state, but an emotional state. I don't like people with green hair and red eyes and 4 arms and so on. I'm uncomfortable with such people and so on. Or I'm attracted to such people. And so we begin to develop this relationship, do we not? And so long, she continues, so long as the contrast of subject and object endures, to wit, as long as we enjoy our 5 senses and no more, and notice, enjoy them, you see, not just use them, but we rather enjoy them, and do not know how to divorce our all-perceiving ego, the higher self, from the thraldom of these senses, so long will it be impossible for the personal ego to break through the barrier which separates it from a knowledge of things in themselves. Now that, of course, is the Kantian statement. One cannot know the Ding an sich, the thing in itself, or substance. That ego, and she's talking now about the personal ego, that ego, progressing in an arc of ascending subjectivity, must exhaust the experience of every plane. We have to really experience every field of our being. And so when we had the principles on the board yesterday, those principles become functional through upadhis, as we said, or through vestures, through containers which nourish them. But it is that way that we do come into the whole process of becoming, remembering always the identity that underlies it. But now we become conscious of it. This is a marvelous statement. That ego, that personal ego, progressing in an arc of ascending subjectivity, must exhaust the experience of every plane. Now that doesn't mean, and this I think we have to be careful about, there is a passage in Light on the Path, for example, which it is said when it was first published became very much misunderstood, that everyone had to sort of go through all of the experiences of being drunk. Today we might say of being addicted to drugs and undergoing every experience, going to prison and being a criminal and a rapist and prostitute and heaven only knows what all. But it was not that. But what is the genuine experience of every level of consciousness? It's not becoming that, but what is the experience of every level of consciousness? Certainly, you see, are we aware of what it really is to have a physical vehicle? And the necessity for having a physical vehicle, and the necessity for being able to function at every level of consciousness. What is the experience of it? So one has to be careful. This doesn't mean you have to, really sink into the gutter and perform every evil act. One doesn't have to become a murderer or any of the other bank forger or whatever you say. But what is the experience of those levels? But not till the unit is merged in the all, whether on this or any other plane, and subject and object alike vanish in the absolute negation of the nirvanic state, Now notice, then she adds, negation again only from our plane. It is not negation, truly. Nirvana is not negation. Although it's from our level, it looks as though it is a wiping out, an extinguishing. But not till this is scaled the peak of omniscience, the knowledge of things in themselves, and the solution of the yet more awful riddle approached, before which even the highest Dhyani Chohan must bow in silence and ignorance, the unspeakable mystery of that which is called by the Vedantins the Parabrahman. It's a magnificent statement, isn't it? Because here, you see, we cannot know the pure object in itself, the reality in itself. But we can come to know that which underlies it. Scaling the peak of omniscience, the knowledge of things in themselves. This, of course, was a direct contradiction of the Kantian philosophy. Wouldn't you say?
Yes, I would, but not of Schopenhauer.
Not of Schopenhauer, no. And Ken has reminded me, of course, that I have overlooked Schopenhauer. I shouldn't have. A very strong influence, of course. But it was Kant who really was the dominant figure, and we pointed that out. This was the philosophical context in which H.P.B. wrote. Very much the dominant, because from Kant on, all Western philosophy really did change. And everything from the period of Kant on had to be referred, in a sense, to Kant's concepts, philosophy. It really did. And so he had a strong influence. The great philosophers I mentioned the first day, the great philosopher of evolution, who was prominent in England at this time, was Herbert Spencer, and H.P.B. was much influenced. Not influenced in the sense of accepting, but influenced in the sense that she had to speak to what Spencer was saying. She had to refer, and she does in the Secret Doctrine, to the German idealists, as we've mentioned, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, and criticized the Hegelian philosophy. She was, therefore, had to use Spencer. These were the philosophers known, very much known, dominant in her time. And so she has to speak to the Kantian proposition, because the Kantian proposition, to which Schopenhauer, of course, spoke, and which he answered very effectively, but the Kantian position had to be addressed, and so she addresses it very clearly, and says, yes, at this level it is true, you cannot know the Ding an sich, the thing in itself, but, if you know the nature of what it is to be man, what it is to be human, if you understand the principles that man is more than the physical, the personal ego, more than this, then one can come to this knowing.
Can I make one point, George? Mm-hmm. Somewhere in your lectures on volume 1, you talked about the one thing. Mm-hmm. And the one thing she said is like, one thing is man, and man is born of Mother Earth, a Mother Moon, and Father Sun. Mm-hmm. Some such sense. About stanza 35 or somewhere in there. And that idea is a whole concept. Mm-hmm. When you take the thing out of it with Kappa, and you put it back into atomic physics, then you have only the reality of the self.
Only the reality of
the self,
yes. Mm-hmm.
the big self.
Yes.
I mean, that's just a comment.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's where I'm at. I'm worried.
Very true. You see, in the notes that were left to us by one of her students, Commander Bowen, which I've mentioned, which were published later in a booklet, Madame Blavatsky, on how to study Theosophy. That, of course, was not the title. That was a title given to it very much later when they were published. Not even when they were originally published, because they were simply originally published as notes by Commander Bowen of HPB's classes. But later they were published as a little booklet, How to Study Theosophy. Commander Bowen reports that in her class, HPB commented and emphasized to her students, existence is one thing, not any collection of things linked together. The atom, the man, the God are each separately as well as collectively absolute being in their last analysis. That is their real individuality. And she emphasized, as I've already emphasized in some of these quotations, it is this idea which must be held always in the background of the mind to form the basis for every conception that arises from the study of the Secret Doctrine. And Commander Bowen said, she added, it is clear that this fundamental one existence or absolute being must be the reality in every form there is. And we can say, therefore, from this point of view, the universe is a holograph in which each part reveals the presence of the whole. Each part. And now this is a new way of thinking, a new way of seeing, if you like, that the universe is indeed a hologram. And every part, every, as she said, atom, man, God, are each separately as well as all collectively this reality. So whatever you look at, now what kind of ethic does this lead to, you think, from this point of view? As we grow into this, what kind of ethic? That everything you look at, you see the reality in it. What the Buddhist of course calls its dharma nature, its truthfulness, its underlying truthfulness. To look at everything, everyone, you know. I mean, maybe it's, you know, there are certain things that I find it difficult to look at. Cockroaches, for example. I find it very difficult to see the underlying absolute reality in the cockroach. I must admit I found that a bit difficult when I was living in India, and I find it difficult even in Ojai if a cockroach invades our kitchen where it doesn't belong, you know. But there, and I suppose there are times too when it becomes very difficult to see this in mosquitoes, you know. But this is the point, that the fundamental one existence or absolute being must be the reality in every form there is. So can we begin to see this primary fact, one existence present in every existence? And I think out of that there does arise an ethic that is challenging, very challenging, a glorious ethic. It's the highest ethic, the ethic of oneness, which is compassion. I don't feel much compassion for cockroaches, I will admit that. And many times I don't feel much compassion for mosquitoes. But, and there are certain other forms that I wish the one reality had taken another course and developed some pleasanter forms in any event. So here we have this direct statement that we are progressing in an arc of ascending subjectivity, must exhaust the experience of everything. Well, speaking of this way of seeing, we can look at item 4 then, which I think is a beautiful statement, because this then does awaken this new mode of knowing and this way of seeing. The one being, this is the ultimate reality, is the noumenon of all the noumena, which we know must underlie phenomena. That behind all phenomena, behind all appearances, must be that which creates the appearance, if you like. If everything is an appearance, phenomenal, transient, then there must be that which creates it. And that which creates it is the noumenon, or the noumena. And the one noumenon is the ultimate reality. Therefore gives them, and give them whatever shadow of reality they possess, but which we have not the senses or the intellect to cognize at present. Now notice that, at present, because of course in anthropogenesis she points very clearly to the further development of other senses. We have 5 senses, there is to be a 6th and a 7th. And so, while at present we do not have the senses to cognize them, this may still be in our future. and certainly do not have the awakened mind to cognize it. And then she uses a magnificent metaphor, a beautiful, beautiful metaphor. And as some of you know, I am fascinated with metaphor. I think I've mentioned it before. But really, everything is metaphor. Everything is a metaphor for the ultimate reality, however we want to see it. So she uses here a beautiful metaphor. The impalpable atoms of gold scattered through the substance of a ton of auriferous quartz may be imperceptible to the naked eye of the miner. Yet he knows that they are not only present there, but that they alone give his quartz any appreciable value. We may look at a piece of auriferous quartz and not see the gold in it at all. We may say, well, it's very beautiful, it's very nice, but it really doesn't have much value. I can use it as a doorstop, or I can use it as a paperweight. But the miner, knowing the value, perceiving in it, sees the value. And this relation of the gold to the quartz may faintly shadow forth that of the noumenon to the phenomenon. But the miner knows what the gold will look like when extracted from the quartz, whereas the common mortal can form no conception of the reality of things separated from the Maya which veils them and in which they are hidden. And how little we do see the value in everything. In everything. There is then that real value. I think it's a beautiful statement and a wonderful metaphor, and it should make us aware. Can we begin, this is a kind of ethic, isn't it? Can we begin to look at everyone, everything, and appreciate its value, appreciate the value, the gold that is there? Sometimes it's not easy to see that. In the reading of the Mahatma letters, I think again and again the adept teachers writing to Mr. Sinnott would point out, well, yes, from your point of view, from the point of view of an educated Englishman who really felt superior to the common herd of India, from this point of view and Mr. Hume's point of view, yes, you did not recognize what was right in front of you. You didn't even see us when we appeared, as it were. There are many instances where the masters seem to say this to Mr. Sinnott. Would you say this is true, Virginia? Wouldn't you say that's true, that they again and again the masters emphasize that Sinnott and Hume were not seeing the value in certain people, in certain individuals who were brought before them. There is again and again this emphasis, but you didn't recognize that this person was there. And we have this in many stories. What is that beautiful story in Christianity? Of the man who did not. Of course, we have the story of the Good Samaritan, but also when did I see you and not recognize you? When did I feed you, and when did I give you water, and so on? When did I clothe you? And it was because it was in every form, however that form seemed to be, that there was the Christ presence.
The other wise man.
The other wise man, yes, thank you, yes. I should remember that from Felix reading.
Inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these, my brethren, you have done it unto me.
Yes, thank you, yes. I'm glad Felix is here. Yes, I should have remembered. It's when, in that wonderful story, Henry Van Dyke, isn't it, the other wise man, and the fact that the fourth wise man did these things, but did not realize. But can we realize, can we become aware that in everyone and everything there is that Christ presence, that Buddha presence, that reality, that underlying reality, the gold, can we recognize the gold in the block of quartz. Well, I think these particular quotations, which I've given you, illustrate then some of the fundamental principles which are built into us as a metaphysic, but which we have to realize in the process of becoming part of the growth of our own being, and that they do involve a self-responsibility. And therefore, the final one, item 7, which I think gives us also a very real key to one of the fundamental principles of the occult philosophy. The universe is worked and guided from within outward. Now that has a number of correlations. The universe is worked and guided from within outward. As above, so it is below. As in heaven, so on earth. And man, the microcosm and miniature copy of the macrocosm, is the living witness to this universal law and to the mode of its action. And one could add there that man is the living witness to every one of the occult laws. Break them and we suffer. Follow them and we grow. Well, we grow through suffering too, of course. We see that every external motion, act, gesture, whether voluntary or mechanical, organic or mental, is produced and preceded by internal feeling or emotion, will or volition, and thought or mind. So, can we become aware of this?
Yes. It occurs to me that we can't break a law.
No.
We break ourselves against it.
Well, that's a good way of putting it, yes. I think Virginia's point is very well taken. We cannot break a law, but we break ourselves against it. Yes, yes. The law cannot be broken. The law can never be broken. But we can certainly stub our toes against it and knock our shins against it and, fall down and walk into it.
It says somewhere that we came from it and returned to it. Does that mean the end of the reincarnation process?
One can take this at a number of different levels. The question is that, this is in item 2, that we emanated from this universal reality, Param Atman and Parabrahman, and we must someday return to it. I think one can take this at a variety of levels. It can be at the end of the entire Manvantara. It can be the end of the cycle of reincarnations when one is liberated, as it were, from the necessity, but one voluntarily then returns as the Bodhisattva, the Nirmanakaya. These are technical terms which we haven't gone into, known to many of you, however. So I think it can take place at many different levels. And ultimately, in the, what shall we say, the conclusion of a whole Manvantara cycle. Yes.
Well, I always give a really simplistic explanation to my own mind of the ocean, the vastness of the ocean, and the wave rising up. But it has to return.
It has to return.
And so the recognition of the return is possible maybe for us, which for the wave. But in other words, we think for a while we're separate.
That's right.
And then the trouble is that we're nothing without the ocean.
Without the ocean. I think that's a very beautiful analogy, because if the wave were to think of itself as separate, it isn't separate. And yet we speak of the waves of an ocean, don't we? As though they were separate. But they would not be there except for the ocean into which they return. Here it's as though the whole ocean is consciousness, and the wave becomes self-conscious and returns that much of awareness, if we can put it this way, of self-consciousness to the ocean, and therefore never fully loses its identity, but achieves its identity because of the ocean. It's, I think, a very wonderful concept that is presented to us throughout. Yes.
Joy, I'd like to tell you about another analogy, which I'm aware of because I became an artist. I remember the first thing I learned when I took art appreciation was the two opposing color theories, which is in the pigment theory, the absence of all colors make the presence of all colors make black,
Yeah.
and the absence of all color leaves your white paper.
Yeah.
That's a pigment theory, but with the light theory, if you take away all the light, it's black or dark, and if you put all the light there, you have all of the colors like in a rainbow. And the
Yeah.
light is refracted through a rainbow, and so they're exactly opposite. But so it's like looking in a mirror, and when you look in a mirror, things are just reversed.
Yes.
But everything is there.
Very good, thank you, Doug. There are many analogies you begin to think about, aren't there? And out of our personal experience, becoming an artist, for example, you became aware of that. If you had not been involved in art, you might not have been aware of that effect, that there is that reversal. This is so very true. But out of it all, I suggest then, is this ethic, an ethic that arises when there is a growing consciousness of our rootedness in the one, the radical unity. An ethic, I think, founded on a conscience of concern, as I like to call it, that there must awaken in every one of us because of this metaphysic, because of these universal, this fundamental universal principle which is presented in the Secret Doctrine. And everything else flows from that there must awaken in us a conscience of concern, concern for everything, the ethic of self and every self responsibility. It's the essence, I think, of the whole wisdom tradition, wisdom religion that we have been given. And there's a wonderful statement by HPB in the introduction, which I did not put among these because it's not so much a principle as a description of the situation in her day in which she wrote. But I think it may even be a description of the situation today. She said, the world of today, and this is as true 100 years later as it was in 1888, the world of today, in its mad career towards the unknown, which it is too ready to confound with the unknowable, interesting statement, is rapidly progressing on the material plane of spirituality. And this is an interesting contradiction almost in terms, the material plane of spirituality. We have materialized the spiritual. We have concretized. We have brought it into a kind of exhibitionism almost. It has now become, she says, it has now become a vast arena, a true valley of discord and of eternal strife, a necropolis, which is, of course, a city of death, a necropolis, wherein lie buried the highest and the most holy aspirations of our spirit soul. And therefore, it is our responsibility, it seems to me, and this is why we study this, to disentomb those holy aspirations. This, of course, is repeated in one of the great legends of the Holy Grail, the story of Lancelot, who was called on to disentomb the... he's told there is an adventure on which he must go, and he asks about the adventure. And he's told that there is a voice coming from the cemetery, from a tombstone, and he must quiet that voice. It's a beautiful story. It's part of the Grail legends. And he does it. Now, each one of us can be a Lancelot and listen to the cry of humanity that is coming from the necropolis of today. There is a cry. We get this also in the beautiful works of Nikos Kazantzakis, the modern Greek writer to whom I've referred on other occasions, that the first thing that humanity must do, that must awaken in each of us, is hearing the cry of humanity. And that is hearing the cry of the entombed God. And we become then saviors of God, as Cousin Zoc has put it. That can we hear, in the midst of all the cacophony of the world, the cry of humanity? This is indeed, I think, what is being told us here. As she says, wherein lie buried the highest and the most holy aspirations of our spirit soul. And I think we have to meet that challenge, to disentomb the aspirations, the really sacred aspirations of humanity. So we have, as I was thinking, as I've always been thinking about the Secret Doctrine, I think the two words that to me summed up are being and responsibility through the process of becoming. Being and responsibility. In one of the contemporary books of scientific theories, the book by John Briggs and David Peat called A Looking Glass Universe, delightful book that summarizes many of the contemporary scientific theories in physics, in biology, and in psychology, brain research, and so on. They put the matter this way. Nature herself is a web of living energy. Each object a mirror made up of strand upon strand of all that is. Now that
That's
is
3 words.
of all that is. Nature herself is a web of living energy. Each object a mirror made up of strand upon strand of all that is. Now, could any statement be more theosophical? You feel that this is a statement that HPB might have written. But this is a statement by two scientists who have given a very perceptive analysis of the contemporary state of modern science. And therefore, it is, I think, incumbent upon us to realize the responsibility that we have. A responsibility which is very much pointed up in some beautiful lines which the Mahatma K.H. wrote to Mr. Sinnott, or quoted to him. Since there is hope for man, only in man, I would not let one cry whom I could save. And that's to disentomb the holy aspirations. It's a law of moral responsibility that goes beyond what is usually talked of as contemporary ethics and morality. A genuine self-responsibility. So let me conclude. I think there is time just to conclude in this with a wonderful statement, therefore, that that we find in HPB's final work, The Voice of the Silence. And I must say, I always recommend that in the study of the Secret Doctrine, one always studies the Voice of the Silence at the same time, or uses it, because the two complement each other. And in the Voice of the Silence we have, now bend thy head and listen well. Compassion speaks and saith, can there be bliss when all that lives must suffer? Shalt thou be saved and hear the whole world cry? Well, if one really studies the Secret Doctrine, if one really comes to the heart of it, that is the message. Live the life, if you would come to the wisdom. And living the life means hearing the aspirations of humanity that have become entombed in the contemporary world, and releasing those aspirations for further growth. So, with that, we can conclude, and thank you all very, very much.